How well do you really know Tennessee? Because across 42,000 square miles and more than 2 centuries of statehood, there's always another story waiting to be discovered. The growing Tennessee History Nerd catalog takes you from the Scopes monkey trial and the Battle of Athens to the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake, the Sultana disaster, the failed state of Franklin, the Iron Men of Sewanee, and much more. And in the Driving Across Tennessee series, we travel county by county to uncover the people, places, communities, and stories that help shape the volunteer state. You'll also find full-length conversations with historians, authors, museum professionals, local experts, and the people working to preserve Tennessee's past. And new episodes and interviews are added every week. Follow the Tennessee History Nerd from your favorite podcast app, explore the catalog, and discover another Tennessee story you never knew you needed to hear. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it and us who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. Tennessee is a big state. Not Texas, California, or Alaska big, but to drive from Johnson City to Memphis, that's about a 500-mile drive. So when we're talking about comprehensively covering the stories of the state, it's a big task. It helps to take it in bite-sized chunks, and one way is a county at a time. So, as promised when we began the podcast, we're going to do that. We're going to drive across the state one county at a time, and frankly, the easiest and probably most ecumenical way to do that is to take the counties alphabetically. And thus, in this county spotlight number 7, we're driving across Bradley County, and we're looking at its story this week. So, make sure you've got your sunglasses on, your drink in the cup holder, and your seatbelt fastened. We're on the road, and we're headed into Bradley County, Tennessee. Coming into Bradley County from Calhoun and McMinn County to the northeast, the history starts from the moment you cross the county line on U.S. Highway 11. In fact, the road you're driving on at that point is itself part of the history because that roadway isn't how U.S. 11, also known as Lee Highway, used to run. The Hiwassee River marks the boundary between McMinn County and Bradley County, itself named when it was created in 1836 for Colonel Edward Bradley, a Revolutionary War veteran from Shelby County, Tennessee, who later served under Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. As a brief aside, Bradley County's boundaries did not remain entirely unchanged. In 1871, a small portion of western Bradley County joined a much larger section of eastern Hamilton County to form James County, the lost county we explored in our previous county spotlight. And nearly half a century later, when James County disappeared in 1919, that former Bradley County territory didn't return. Still separated geographically from Cleveland and more closely aligned with Chattanooga, its residents chose instead to become part of Hamilton County. As you cross the Hiwassee River, just across the bridge, you'll encounter the intersection of Water Street as you come into Charleston, Bradley County's sister town to Calhoun. If you turn left onto Water Street, right at the point you're approaching the railroad tracks, you encounter to your right the old US 11. As best as I can tell, US 11 ran a couple hundred yards parallel to the east of the current US 11 for a good ways. And there are actually signs along the road, which is called Market Street today, that indicate it is historic US 11, but there's no bridge across the Hiwassee into Calhoun by that route anymore. And while parts of Old 11 do still exist in Calhoun as well, the section from where Old 11 crosses Route 163 in Calhoun all the way to the Hiwassee River has ceased to exist. And its bed isn't even visible on satellite imagery anymore, although LiDAR might still show it, but I haven't seen any LiDAR images to know. That change in the route of US 11 coincided with TVA activities, specifically the impoundment of Chickamauga Lake on the Tennessee River in 1940, which also altered the height of its tributaries, including the Hiwassee. It was due to this that the path of Lee Highway, US 11, was changed as a new bridge had to be built for the higher river levels. I share all this just to note that the history of Tennessee is often layered and things change. And after a few decades, no one even remembers how things used to be anymore, or if they do, why things changed. And the history of Bradley County is quite definitely layered, as we'll see today. And the earliest layers belong to the Native Americans. And when the white settlers first really began coming onto the western slopes of the Appalachians, this was primarily Cherokee land. At one time, the areas inhabited by the Cherokee and claimed by them as hunting ground encompassed about 80 million acres. By the early 1800s, due to cessions through treaties, that had diminished to about 8 million acres. 8 million acres sounds huge. It's about 12,500 square miles. But when you realize that it's only a tenth of their previous holdings, it becomes evident that they'd given up the vast majority of what they previously claimed. And that's why crossing the Hiwassee River is so important to our story today, because before the Treaty of New Echota was signed at the end of 1835, largely under a state of coercion by Georgia and the U.S. federal government, all of what is today Bradley County, Tennessee, was part of the territory owned by the Cherokee Nation. And the Hiwassee River marked the boundary between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. I'm not going to go too deeply into the Treaty of New Echota today. Next week, I'll be starting a series of recurring episodes dealing with the Trail of Tears, and we'll talk more in detail then about this treaty. Suffice it to say that the Cherokee still owned 8 million acres, and the white settlers flooding into what is the modern-day southeastern United States wanted it. And so at the end of 1835, Cherokee Representatives Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, also pronounced by some as Boudinot, signed the treaty under substantial pressure. However, they didn't represent the desires of most of the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross viewed it, as a result, as an invalid treaty, and even today many Cherokees call it the Ocoee Steal. But President Andrew Jackson used it as the basis for beginning the removal of the Cherokee to the territory in modern-day Oklahoma. Why that matters for today's discussion is that pretty much the entire footprint of modern-day Charleston, Tennessee, was within the footprint of Old Fort Cass, one of the forts established by the federal government for the detainment of the Cherokee in advance of their removal to the west. To be clear, Old Fort Cass was, according to the Hiwassee River Heritage Center, a roughly 30 to 40 square mile complex of camps and facilities encompassing all of modern-day Charleston and extending toward Cleveland. That means that by and large, you can't go and find Fort Cass or any part of what was there in the late 1830s during the time that the Cherokees were preparing to leave. However, the Hiwassee River Heritage Center is available in Charleston and does a good job of putting things in context from its location, and its purpose is to tell that story. About 3 miles southeast of the military headquarters at Fort Cass lay Rattlesnake Springs, one of the principal encampments within the sprawling Fort Cass detention complex. The spring provided water for the Cherokee imprisoned there, while nearby Camp Foster and Camp Worth housed the troops assigned to guard them. But Rattlesnake Springs became far more than an internment camp. Here, before departing their eastern homeland, Cherokee leaders held their final council in the east. They mourned what was being taken from them, but they also resolved that the Cherokee Nation would survive, that they would carry their constitution, their laws, their language, and their identity west with them. For many of the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears began in earnest from Rattlesnake Springs. Rattlesnake Springs was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975, recognizing its national historical significance. However, unlike some of the other sites we'll discuss today, Rattlesnake Springs remains privately owned and it isn't open to public visitation. Charleston also was important during the event that tore our nation apart almost 3 decades later, the Civil War. Just to the east of old US 11 is where the railroad crosses the Hiwassee River, and remarkably, it was in the same location then as it is today. In fact, the bridge for today's rail line is on the original pre-Civil War masonry piers, dating back to the original bridge constructed in the 1840s for the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad. Controlling that bridge meant controlling the movement of soldiers, supplies, equipment, and information through East Tennessee. Charleston itself was small, but the transportation infrastructure there made it disproportionately important. The bridge at the time of the Civil War was a wooden-covered railroad bridge, and on November 8, 1861, Union partisans under Alfred Cate burned that bridge. But when the Union Army didn't arrive as expected, the Confederates rebuilt the bridge. And this led to the Confederates imposing tighter control over East Tennessee, arresting suspected Unionists, suspending normal legal protections, and ultimately executing several participants in the broader conspiracy behind the destruction of the bridge. In November 1863, Union forces defeated Braxton Bragg's army at Missionary Ridge. As Confederate forces withdrew, they damaged the Hiwassee Bridge at Charleston to slow down the Federal advance. And that brings us to our last stop in Charleston, the Henegar House. Folks, if you're looking for a great Tennessee getaway, let me tell you about Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on beautiful Kentucky Lake on the scenic Tennessee River, Birdsong is just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, making it an easy drive halfway between Memphis and Nashville. The Keast family has proudly owned and operated Birdsong since 1961, and today the second generation of Keasts continues that tradition of excellent hospitality. Birdsong offers cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, and a large concrete boat ramp for easy access to Kentucky Lake. While you're there, don't miss the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll discover Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call them, tell them Big John sent you. The Henegar House actually had ties to the removal period. Henry Benton Henegar had served John Ross during the Cherokee removal, and the house stood on part of the former Fort Cass grounds. And it's barely a stone's throw from the railroad bridge across the Hiwassee, so that may be why it served as the headquarters for both Confederate and Union generals during the war. Confederate Generals Marcus J. Wright and Simon Bolivar Buckner, as well as Union Generals Oliver O. Howard and William Tecumseh Sherman, stayed there, which is probably ironically appropriate given that Henry was a Unionist while his wife Margaret Lee Henegar supported secession. The damage done to the railroad bridge by the Confederates as they retreated from Missionary Ridge and the resulting delay brought Sherman to Charleston on November 30th, 1863. He stayed at the Henegar House, where Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana delivered orders from Ulysses S. Grant, directing Sherman to take command of troops marching north to relieve Ambrose Burnside, then besieged by James Longstreet at Knoxville. On December 28, 1863, Confederate cavalry under Joseph Wheeler attacked a Union wagon train of approximately 300 wagons as it crossed the Hiwassee at Charleston. The Confederates badly needed supplies after their defeat at Missionary Ridge. Colonel Bernard Labold's infantry defended the wagons while Colonel Eli Long's Union cavalry crossed the river and attacked Wheeler's men. The Confederates were routed and withdrew toward Dalton. Union forces subsequently held Charleston for the remainder of the war and constructed blockhouses on both sides of the river to protect the railroad bridge. Incidentally, the Henegar House still stands today, and you can drive by it, and there's even a Civil War Trails marker next to it. But the house itself is a private residence and isn't open to the public. So Charleston has had historical significance disproportionately greater than its small size, but now we continue our drive southward toward the county seat of Cleveland. Just as Bradley County honors a military figure with its name, so also does the town of Cleveland itself, which was named for Colonel Benjamin Cleveland of North Carolina, a Revolutionary War officer noted for his service at Kings Mountain. Cleveland was established as the seat of government for the newly created Bradley County in 1836, and as you might expect in a county that had only just been opened to white settlement, the first courthouse was a relatively simple log structure. That was replaced by a brick courthouse in 1839, and that building served the county for more than half a century. But in those years, Cleveland grew from a small frontier county seat into a city with expanding transportation, commercial, and industrial importance. By the 1890s, Bradley County was ready for a courthouse that reflected that progress. Designed by the Chattanooga architectural firm of Hunt and Lamb, the magnificent courthouse, completed in 1892, rose above the center of Cleveland with a large clock and bell tower. It was the kind of public building intended to represent the dignity and permanence of the community it served. The bell installed in that tower in 1893 weighed about 1,200 pounds. Unfortunately, in the early 1960s, Bradley County exchanged that magnificent old courthouse for the much more utilitarian structure standing there today. A functional building, perhaps, but one lacking much of the character of its predecessor. The old courthouse was razed in 1963, and the present courthouse was constructed in 1963 and 64. The bell from the old tower survived, however, and in 1992, it was returned to the courthouse square as part of Cleveland's sesquicentennial celebration. And I understand that progress sometimes requires change. Old buildings can become expensive to maintain, if inefficient for modern government, and increasingly difficult to adapt. But when you compare photographs of the old courthouse with the building that replaced it, it's difficult not to feel that Cleveland lost something. The old courthouse didn't merely provide office space. It gave the center of town a visual identity. Some counties have subsequently chosen instead to keep the old courthouse for the sake of heritage and to move some or all of the functions of government to other facilities. In Bradley County's case, the decision was made to tear down and replace rather than move its functions to a different location. That loss was, I believe, unfortunate. However, the changing courthouses are only one example of the layers of history that have accumulated in Cleveland. Another can be found in the railroad tracks, and in many ways, the railroad explains how Cleveland grew beyond its original role as a county seat. The Hiwassee Railroad Company had been chartered by the Tennessee General Assembly in 1836, the same year Bradley County was created. After a period of financial difficulty and reorganization, it became the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad. By the 1850s, the line connected Cleveland with Dalton to the south and Knoxville to the north. Another line connected Cleveland with Chattanooga. That placed Cleveland along one of the most important transportation corridors in the region. These railroads linked East Tennessee and Virginia with Chattanooga, Atlanta, and the Deep South. People, mail, agricultural products, manufactured goods, and information could move through Cleveland far more rapidly than they had in the days when everything traveled by wagon or horseback. The railroad encouraged commerce, brought outside markets within reach of Cleveland businesses, and helped create the conditions that would later support the city's manufacturing economy. But the same railroad that brought economic opportunity also made Cleveland a military objective when the Civil War began. East Tennessee was deeply divided over secession, and Bradley County was no exception. While many residents supported the Confederacy, the county also contained strong Unionist sentiment. Families, churches, and communities found themselves divided by conflict that was both national and intensely personal. Confederate forces occupied Cleveland early in the war, partly to control the railroad and protect the vital crossing of the Hiwassee River at Charleston. Cleveland also stood near the copper-producing district around Ducktown, and a copper rolling mill operated in the city. Copper was essential for the production of ammunition, making Cleveland's industrial facilities important to the Confederate war effort. But above all, it was the railroad that placed Cleveland on the strategic map. In June 1862, President Abraham Lincoln emphasized Cleveland's importance in a telegram to General Henry Halleck, stating, "To take and hold the railroad at or east of Cleveland in East Tennessee, I think fully as important as the taking and holding of Richmond." That's an extraordinary statement. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, yet Lincoln believed controlling the railroad at or near Cleveland was comparable in importance. That tells us how vital this corridor was to the movement of Confederate soldiers and supplies, and how valuable it would be to the Union if federal forces could seize it. But Cleveland remained under Confederate control until the autumn of 1863. Following the Union victories at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge in November 1863, Confederate forces withdrew southward, and Union troops moved into Cleveland. Colonel Eli Long led Federal cavalry into the city, where his men damaged railroad tracks, destroyed Confederate supplies, and struck at the copper rolling operation. Union officers subsequently established their headquarters at the home of Julius Eckhart Wright, whose house overlooked Cleveland, the railroad depot, and the surrounding area. Wright was deeply involved in the regional copper industry, and his home offered both an excellent view and a prominent location from which to oversee federal operations. Union forces constructed fortifications on high ground around the town. Fort McPherson stood in the vicinity of what is now Hillcrest Memorial Gardens on South Ocoee Street, while Fort Sedgwick occupied the elevation remembered today as Fort Hill. Those fortifications proved useful in 1864 when Confederate cavalry commanded by General Joseph Wheeler attacked Cleveland. Federal troops successfully resisted the raid, and the railroad remained under Union control. So when we pass Fort Hill later in our drive, we aren't merely passing an old cemetery or an elevated piece of ground. We're passing one of the places from which Union soldiers defended Cleveland, its railroad, and the transportation corridor Lincoln considered so vital. The Civil War damaged Cleveland and disrupted its economy, but the city's location along the railroad remained an advantage after the fighting ended. The same tracks that had carried troops and military supplies could now carry raw materials into Cleveland and finished products out to regional and national markets. And that leads to one of the most important chapters in Cleveland's history: manufacturing. Some Tennessee stories really need to be seen as well as heard. For only 99 cents a month, you can come along with me through exclusive on-site videos and bonus content from across the volunteer state with a subscription to the Tennessee History Nerd Facebook page. Step inside the Ray County courtroom where the Scopes monkey trial unfolded. Walk the streets of Athens and see the places where the veterans returning from World War II fought to take back their town. And join me at historic sites, museums, courthouses, battlefields, and communities as I search for the stories that help shape Tennessee Tennessee. Your subscription also helps to support the travel, research, and field work that make the Tennessee History Nerd possible. Visit the Tennessee History Nerd on Facebook, tap the subscribe button, and come explore Tennessee history with me. And now, let's get back to the story. One of the businesses most closely associated with that growth was the Cleveland Woolen Mills, established in 1880. Local wool could be brought into the mill, cleaned, processed, spun into thread, woven into cloth, and ultimately turned into finished garments. What began as a local enterprise grew into a substantial manufacturing operation whose products were sold well beyond Bradley County. The company eventually became known as Hardwick Woolen Mills and later Hardwick Clothes. By 1927, Hardwick Woolen Mills employed approximately 760 people, making it the largest employer in Cleveland at the time. That number matters because it reminds us that Cleveland's industrial history isn't simply a history of companies, buildings, and brand names. It's the history of hundreds and eventually thousands of people who earned their living in these plants. Their days were structured around shifts, production schedules, machinery, and factory whistles. Their paychecks supported homes, stores, schools, churches, and other businesses throughout Bradley County. The old mill complex remains one of the most visible physical reminders of that period. Hardwick Woolen Mills was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2001, recognizing both the architecture of the surviving buildings and the mill's importance to Cleveland's industrial development. But cloth and clothing were only part of that story. Cleveland also became one of the country's important centers for the manufacture of stoves and cooking appliances. The Hardwick family entered the stove business during the 1870s when cast iron stoves were being produced on a relatively small scale. From those beginnings, Hardwick Stove developed into a major Cleveland manufacturer. Other companies followed, and the stove industry eventually became one of Bradley County's largest manufacturing sectors. Among the names associated with Cleveland were Hardwick, Brown Stove Works, Dixie Products, and Magic Chef. Brown Stove Works was established in Cleveland by Grover Cleveland Brown in 1935, and unlike many of the other stove manufacturers that disappeared through closure or corporate consolidation, Brown Stove Works continued operating as an independent Cleveland manufacturer. Dixie Products became another important part of the industry and acquired the much larger Magic Chef Company in 1958. The Magic Chef name was so widely recognized that it became the name of the combined corporation. In 1986, Maytag purchased Magic Chef, bringing Cleveland's appliance operations under another famous American brand. Whirlpool then acquired Maytag in 2006. In 2012, Whirlpool opened a new 1 million square foot cooking appliance manufacturing facility in Cleveland, replacing a factory complex whose industrial roots reach back more than a century. So, although the corporate names have changed, Cleveland's connection to appliance manufacturing continues. And this particular part of the story strikes close to home for me. When I was growing up, we had a Magic Chef stove. I have no way of knowing with certainty where that particular stove was built, but there's a very real possibility that it was manufactured right here in Cleveland, Tennessee. And that's the kind of connection we can easily overlook. A stove sitting in a family kitchen may appear to be an ordinary household appliance, but it was also the product of foundries, assembly lines, railroad connections, corporate decisions, and the labor of men and women in places like Cleveland. The woolen mills and the appliance plants helped to transform Cleveland from a courthouse town along the railroad into one of Tennessee's significant manufacturing centers. The city ultimately attracted a much broader and more diversified collection of industries, but textiles, clothing, stoves, and appliances were among the foundations upon which that industrial economy was built. Manufacturing represents only one way Cleveland reinvented itself. Another can be seen just east of downtown, where one piece of property has now served as the home of three different colleges. The first was Centenary College and Music School, a Methodist institution established on the site in the 1880s. Parts of the original Centenary structure remained incorporated into what is now Lee University's administration building. Centenary eventually closed, but the campus didn't cease to serve an educational purpose. Bob Jones College, founded by evangelist Bob Jones Sr., moved from Florida to Cleveland in 1933. For 14 years, students studied on the former Centenary campus before Bob Jones College relocated to Greenville, South Carolina in 1947, where it became Bob Jones University. Its departure created an opportunity for another religious school. The Church of God had opened its Bible training school in Cleveland in 1918 with one teacher, Nora I. Chambers, and 12 students. The school later moved to Sevierville, but after Bob Jones College left Cleveland, the Church of God purchased the campus and brought its school back to the city where it had begun. The move was completed in time for the 1947 and 48 school term, and the institution was named Lee College in honor of F.J. Lee, its second president. For several decades, Lee remained a relatively small denominational college. Then, under the presidency of Paul Kahn, which began in 1986, the school experienced a period of extraordinary growth. Enrollment increased from approximately 1,000 students to more than 5,000. The campus expanded. New academic programs were added, and new buildings substantially altered the landscape surrounding the old Centenary property. In 1997, Lee College became Lee University. The growth of Lee over the last 4 decades has undeniably changed Cleveland. It's brought thousands of students into the city, expanded the physical footprint of the campus, increased employment, and given Cleveland an educational and cultural influence extending well beyond Bradley County. The Church of God, whose international offices are also located in Cleveland, is another important part of the city's identity. But neither Lee University nor the Church of God constitutes the whole story of Cleveland. They're part of a much larger collection of historical layers. Cleveland has been a Cherokee homeland, a frontier county seat, a divided Civil War community, a strategic railroad center, a textile town, an appliance manufacturing center, and a college town. The courthouse square tells part of the story. The railroad tells another. So do Fort Hill, the old woolen mills, the factories, and a college campus that now has educated students under 3 different institutional names. And the remarkable thing is that these stories don't exist independently of one another. The railroad that made Cleveland strategically important during the Civil War later helped support its factories. The prosperity generated by industry contributed to the growth of the city. That expanding city supported larger civic, religious, and educational institutions. Each generation built upon, replaced, preserved, or sometimes demolished what the previous generation had left behind. That's what makes the history of Cleveland and Bradley County as a whole so layered. The modern city didn't simply replace what came before it. Pieces of those earlier Clevelands remain visible if you know where to look. The old courthouse bell on display in front of the current courthouse. The old train depot on Edwards Street, sometimes half hidden by the buses and vans of the Cleveland Urban Area Transit System. The old Hardwick Woolen Mill building, now at least partially housing multiple businesses in an attempt at urban renewal. And the Confederate Memorial right at the split on Ocoee Street where the road divides to go downtown, right across from the old Craig Miles house. And as we continue south through the city, we'll pass 2 more places that connect Cleveland and Bradley County to the Civil War, Fort Hill and Blue Springs. How many stories can one small barrier island possibly hold? Enough for an entire podcast, and we're just getting started. This is Big John Summers, and when I'm not traveling across Tennessee, I'm down south exploring Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Alabama Gulf Coast for our sister podcast, Dauphin Island Diaries. You'll hear stories about Fort Gaines, the island's ancient shell mounds, Sand Island Lighthouse, Alabama's artificial reefs, the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and much more. You'll also hear full-length conversations with island personalities and subject matter experts who help bring these Gulf Coast stories to life. It's the same boots-on-the-ground storytelling you enjoy on the Tennessee History Nerd taken to Mobile Bay and the Gulf Coast. Just search for Dauphin Island Diaries and follow it in your favorite podcast app. And now, let's get back to the Tennessee story. Fort Hill Cemetery occupies some of the highest ground overlooking Cleveland. Before it became known as Fort Hill, it was called City Cemetery. But during the Civil War, its elevation made it valuable for more than burials. From there, Union troops had a commanding view of downtown Cleveland, the railroad depot, and the transportation routes approaching the city. Federal forces constructed Fort Sedgwick on the hill, while Fort McPherson stood on another high point near what is now Hillcrest Memorial Gardens. Together, the two positions allowed Union artillery to defend Cleveland and the railroad during Confederate General Joseph Wheeler's 1864 raid. But Fort Hill also preserves some of the human cost of the war. Both Union and Confederate soldiers are buried there. 17 Confederate soldiers killed in a train wreck south of Cleveland on November 4, 1862, were buried together in a mass grave. Union soldiers killed in later fighting around Cleveland were also interred in the cemetery. Among them was 19-year-old Private Hazard Barrere of the 1st Ohio Cavalry, who was mortally wounded on Inman Street in November 1863. Enslaved people belonging to a Confederate sympathizer, Jane Hardwick, carried the Union soldier into her home, where Hardwick and her daughters cared for him until he died. That one story demonstrates just how complicated the war could be in a divided community. A Union soldier lay dying in the home of a Confederate supporter after being carried there by people who were themselves enslaved. The larger conflict divided people into armies and political factions, but individual moments didn't always neatly fit within those divisions. At the entrance to Fort Hill Cemetery stands another unusual reminder of the war. In 1914, Cleveland's chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, the principal organization for Union veterans, erected a monument honoring Bradley County's Boys in Blue. It's reportedly one of only 3 Grand Army of the Republic monuments in Tennessee. From Fort Hill, we continue south out of Cleveland toward Blue Springs. After the Union victories around Chattanooga in November 1863, the 1st Division of the Union Army's 4th Corps, commanded by General David S. Stanley, established a large winter encampment in the valley around Blue Springs. By April 1864, more than 9,000 Union soldiers were camped there, positioned between Cleveland and the Confederate Army around Dalton, Georgia. The site offered what an army needed. Colonel William Gross described it as a good camping ground with good water and plenty of wood. But even at a good campsite, the winter was difficult. Father Peter Cooney, chaplain of the 35th Indiana Infantry, also known as the 1st Irish Regiment, wrote of harsh conditions and a 10-inch snowfall late in March. Nevertheless, Blue Springs became more than a collection of tents and military equipment. Some officers sent for their wives. Religious services were conducted, and soldiers passed the long winter evenings with meetings, songs, jokes, and conversation. On Easter Sunday in 1864, Father Cooney conducted services for the soldiers gathered there. The troops also remained connected to Cleveland. On February 10th, Colonels Gross and Lewis Waters traveled from Blue Springs into town, where more than 2,000 people gathered to hear patriotic speeches and watch the Stars and Stripes raised over Cleveland. But Blue Springs was not simply a place to wait out the winter. Federal troops guarded against Confederate raids into Tennessee and tested the Confederate defenses south of them. Between February 22nd and 27th, Union forces advanced toward Dalton in a military demonstration that produced heavy fighting and left hundreds dead, wounded, and captured on both sides. That operation provided a preview of the larger campaign to come. In early May 1864, the camps at Blue Springs emptied as the Union Army moved south to begin the Atlanta campaign. The men who had spent the winter talking, singing, worshiping, and trying to stay warm were now marching towards some of the hardest fighting of the war. Today, little remains to suggest that more than 9,000 soldiers once occupied that valley, but Blue Springs represents the moment when Cleveland and Bradley counties ceased to be merely objectives in the struggle for East Tennessee and became a staging ground for the Union advance into the heart of Georgia. And from Blue Springs, our route continues south toward Red Clay, where we return to the Cherokee story with which our drive through Bradley County began. Leaving Blue Springs, we continued south toward the Tennessee-Georgia state line and Red Clay State Historic Park. And here, at the southern end of our drive, we return to the Cherokee story with which we began when we crossed the Hiwassee River into Bradley County. Red Clay became important because of what was happening just across that state line. Between 1828 and 1830, Georgia passed a series of laws intended to dismantle the Cherokee Nation within Georgia's claimed borders. The state declared Cherokee laws null and void, extended Georgia jurisdiction over Cherokee territory, and prohibited the Cherokees from meeting unless the purpose of the meeting was to surrender Cherokee land. The Cherokee capital had been established at New Echota in Georgia during the 1820s, but under those laws, the Cherokee government could no longer function safely there. The council met once in Alabama in 1831 and then moved to Red Clay in Tennessee in 1832. As one of the speakers in the interpretive film at the Red Clay State Park explains, the councils were held there because the Cherokee government could not function in Georgia. The persecution in Tennessee was not nearly that bad. Red Clay, therefore, became the final seat of the Cherokee national government in the East, not because the Cherokee had chosen to abandon New Echota, but because Georgia had made it effectively impossible for them to continue meeting there. Between 1832 and 1837, the Cherokee held 11 general councils at Red Clay. Thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children sometimes gathered there for days. Their camps extended through the woods surrounding the council grounds, reportedly stretching for miles. The water from the Blue Hole Spring helped to make such gatherings possible. The spring still flows today, pouring clear water into a deep, strikingly blue pool before forming a stream that runs through the park. When thousands of people assembled at Red Clay, that dependable source of fresh water was essential. The large council house stood near the spring. Its precise location and dimensions are uncertain. 3 archaeological investigations conducted between 1973 and 1976 failed to determine exactly where it had stood. The council house you see at the park today is a reconstruction based upon eyewitness descriptions and a painting by John Mix Stanley. One first-hand account described the original council house as a simple rectangular structure formed from logs with open sides and benches for the councilors. Other evidence suggests it may have been considerably larger than the modern replica, possibly with an opening in the roof that allowed smoke from the council fire to escape. Delegates representing the 8 districts of the Cherokee Nation would have sat on benches around its perimeter. The smaller structures reconstructed nearby represent sleeping huts used by some of the Cherokee and their visitors during the council meetings. These weren't teepees. They were hastily constructed log shelters without windows, chinking, or in some cases even doors. removal dominated the discussions at Red Clay. Principal Chief John Ross and the National Party represented the great majority of the Cherokee people and continued resisting removal. They petitioned Congress, appealed to the president, pursued relief through the courts, and insisted that existing treaties between the Cherokee Nation and the United States be honored. Another group, eventually known as the Treaty Party, concluded that remaining in the East had become impossible. Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and others did not necessarily want to leave their homeland. They'd instead become convinced that negotiating the best available terms for removal offered the only realistic hope that the Cherokee Nation could survive. Those competing positions produced intense and sometimes bitter debate, but both groups were responding to the same crisis. Georgia was seizing Cherokee property, the federal government was refusing to protect Cherokee treaty rights, and white settlers were flooding into Cherokee lands. While Ross was in Washington attempting to negotiate directly with the federal government, members of the Treaty Party signed the Treaty of New Echota in December 1835. As noted earlier, they didn't have authorization from the majority of the Cherokee Nation to surrender its land. Ross and the National Party rejected the treaty, but the United States Senate ratified it, and President Andrew Jackson treated it as legal authority for removal. The councils at Red Clay continued as the Cherokee struggled against the approaching deadline. The last council held here took place in August 1837. A later council planned for 1838 never convened. Instead, federal troops moved into the Cherokee Nation in May, rounded up more than 16,000 Cherokee people, and confined them in removal camps, including the enormous Fort Cass complex with which we began our journey through Charleston. And so the two ends of our drive connect. At Red Clay, the Cherokee debated how their nation might survive. At Rattlesnake Springs and Fort Cass, they were imprisoned before being driven west. The decisions made or imposed at one end of Bradley County produced the suffering that unfolded at the other. But Red Clay's story doesn't end with an empty council ground. According to the interpretation at the park, when the Cherokee departed after the final council, the keeper of the sacred fire preserved embers from the council fire. Those embers were divided among 4 pots and carried west with the Cherokee. In 1951, leaders of the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians retraced the Trail of Tears and visited the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. During that visit, the keeper of the fire allowed members of the eastern band to carry some of the sacred fire back east. Then, on April 6, 1984, representatives of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma gathered at Red Clay, the first reunion there of the Eastern and Western Cherokee since removal. 7 Cherokee runners carried a torch bearing the sacred fire from Cherokee, North Carolina, to Red Clay. That fire was used to light the eternal flame that burns at the park today. The monument commemorates both the Cherokee who suffered and died along the Trail of Tears and the reunion of the Cherokee people at Red Clay. Its inscription connects 2 dates: August 7th, 1837, the final council held here, and April 6th, 1984, when the descendants of those separated by removal gathered once again on the old council grounds. Nearly a century and a half after Georgia attempted to destroy their government, after the federal government drove them from their homeland, and after thousands died during removal, the Cherokee returned to Red Clay, not as a vanished people remembered only through reconstructed buildings and historical markers, but as a living nation. And so our drive across Bradley County comes full circle. We entered the county by crossing a river that once marked the boundary of the Cherokee Nation. We passed through Charleston, Fort Cass, and Rattlesnake Springs, where the Cherokees were gathered and imprisoned for removal. We traveled through the county and city created after their land was taken. And now, at the Tennessee-Georgia line, we stand where the Cherokee leaders gathered in their final effort to preserve their homeland and their government. The council grounds once fell silent. The Cherokee did not. The sacred fire burns at Red Clay today as a declaration of endurance and survival. They are still here. And that's going to do it for this week's episode 25, Driving Across Tennessee, the Bradley County edition. But next week, we'll actually pick up some of the threads from this week's episode and examine them in greater detail when we begin a multi-part series on the Trail of Tears. Join us next week for episode 26, Trail of Tears Part 1, Origins. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee History Nerd, and I am history. So as we do each week, I want to acknowledge the folks whose work has contributed to the material we used for today's episode. Sources for this episode include I Remember, Tall Tales and True of Cleveland and Bradley County, drawn from the recollections and research of Louise Harley, John C. Bowman's Bradley County entry in the Tennessee Encyclopedia, and materials from Tennessee History for Kids. Lift High the Flame, Visions of Lee University, edited by Jay Sheridan with photography by Robin Hood, provided some of the background on the progression of the colleges at the location now occupied by Lee University. I also drew from exhibits and interpretive materials at the Museum and Cultural Center at 5 Points, at Fort Hill Cemetery, at Lee University, and at Red Clay Historic Park, including the park's interpretive film, We Are Still Here. Additionally, I relied on materials and exhibits at the Hiwassee River Heritage Center, and I want to say a special thank you to Darlene Goins for her assistance in my visits there. Other information also came from historical markers throughout Bradley County, the National Register of Historic Places materials, and my own visits to sites around Charleston, Cleveland, Fort Hill, Blue Springs, and Red Clay. I offer my profound thanks to all these organizations and to the historians, preservationists, and community members whose work has helped preserve the many layers of Bradley County's story. And as always, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for listening and for your continued support of the podcast. Tennessee history isn't found only in museums, courthouses, and archives. Sometimes it's preserved in a family story, an old photograph, or a memory that only you can share. If today's episode raised a question, brought back a memory, or reminded you of another Tennessee story that deserves to be told, I'd love to hear from you. Use the Send Fan Mail link in the episode description. Email me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com or join the conversation on the Tennessee History Nerd Facebook page. And if you enjoyed this episode, help someone else discover it. Before you close your podcast app, share it with one person who loves Tennessee or wants to understand its history a little better. Your voice can help preserve Tennessee stories and introduce them to a new generation of listeners.